I do. So here's something I take away, and I was reminded when we did this whole thing, it's how fast that happens. I was talking about at the very end of my last talk, but like 1821 to 1875 feels like light years because there's so many different things happening there. Spain to Mexico to revolution to republic to independence to the Civil War to Reconstruction. So a lot happens in 50 years, but it's just 50 years. That's what's astounding to me, of just how quickly all of that happens. And I think trying to convey that to our students is, I mean, for 12-year-olds, I think it's pretty hard to imagine 50 years is a short period of time, but speed with which it happens, I think is one of the things I take away the most often that I try to express to my students.
One of the things we had talked about in our group, and I agree with, is that I like the, I don't like, we tend to sometimes in Texas history say, we teach natural Texas and its people, and then suddenly there's no more talk about the Indians. Oh, they must have just disappeared all of a sudden. There's no discussion on what was going on with them. And so to have all these resources to say, as we're going, progressing through the history of Texas, saying, and then this is what was going on with the Indians there in this time. And this, I like that, having those resources there to just remind them that, it wasn't just white Europeans that had come in. It wasn't just the Spanish. It wasn't just Mexico. That there were other groups involved in all aspects of Texas history. And I'd said too that you kind of did that with teaching the Revolution this summer. And I don't know if y'all are offering that again in the fall. I couldn't remember, but I would recommend that to anyone that didn't do it this summer. That is certainly, it was well worth the time, just as this one has been as well.
Thank you. I really appreciate that. I really appreciate you sharing that. Yeah, I think you said it really well, is that Texas is this like borderland overlap between all these different places, like these different groups competing for space all over the place. And that's what makes it both complex and then as a result, I think really interesting to teach, because it's not just one story. It's 14 different stories all competing in the same space at the same time. And that makes it really hard to teach in a sense. It's really complex, but it's fascinating and has so much to say to all these different groups as a result, I think. The floor is open to anybody who wants to share anything.
Well, I was just telling my group that I'm a first-year teacher and don't look like a first-year teacher, but I'm a first-year teacher. And so I took Texas history a long time ago. And honestly, I had no idea how much the destruction of the bison of the buffalo played in the destruction of the Plains Indians. Because whenever I think of that, I always think of dances with wolves, and I always think of Colorado and Wyoming. I had no idea that it was going on at such a level in Texas as well. So that's going to be something that I'll definitely be bringing up with my kids when we get to that.
And I was also in her group, and we were talking, that's where I brought up that photo that I dropped there in the chat. And I think, with everything changing with like the ethnic studies classes that are starting now in a lot of school districts, and, courses like this where we're being, I guess our attention's being directed and we're more mindful of all perspectives. If you really look at our scope and sequence, I think that we almost do a disadvantage. We discussed this in our group. We teach the Native Americans from the forefront in Unit 1, and we hit them really hard, but then they kind of phase out, right? I mean, Quanah Parker bubbles up again, but we don't do justice, I feel like, for when you were talking about the Comanche and how they were involved, during the Texas Revolution. I mean, that's not really mentioned very strongly at all in our scope. And so we focus on, the Anglo and the Mexican perspective. And I think we leave that out without mindfulness on the teacher or the instructor to bring that in, because it's not part of our curriculum. So hopefully moving forward, it will become more of a part of our curriculum and that'll be written in. But I think that this course was definitely good for me because it gave me that perspective to remember, oh yeah, I need to make sure that I hit on that when I'm in Unit 3 and I'm teaching the Texas Revolution, and include those things because it's so important. And that's when I saw that picture this weekend. I was like, wow, we talk about Manifest Destiny and we always show that very famous painting. And then I
Mhm.
saw this one with the Native American and I was like, oh my gosh, I'm totally going to use that because I want them to think about that other perspective.
Yeah. I think you said it really well. It's hard to bring in these perspectives because you guys have so much to hit already with the teaks. And there's so much content to cover, and finding ways to loop things in. I think what I took away from these 4 weeks is opportunities to hook them into things I'm already talking about. So when I talk about secession, for example, right, and the resistance to secession along the frontier, it's a good moment to remind, because I'm going to talk about secession anyway, good moment to loop back in that the Comanche, in this case, the Kiowa and the Apache on the frontier, was in the minds of those Texans who were living along that edge at the time of secession. And they've got a different perspective on whether they want the U.S. Army in Texas or not. It's a good moment to kind of bring that back in. And as you said, not just have it in natural Texas and its peoples, and then, oops, Quanah Parker, and then that's kind of it. And everything in between doesn't really come back in part of the story.